Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today to our Fireside Chat series session. And we are really glad that you're here with us today. And if you have any questions during the meeting, please let us know. Today's session is Stronger Bonds Parenting Teams with Modern Worries. We are so glad again that you're here with us tonight. Throughout the event, what we would encourage is that you to share your thoughts or questions in the chat box. So we'll be addressing as many possible questions during our Q&A session. So don't hesitate to contribute. We're really looking forward to hearing from you and making this event interactive experience. And before we dive into tonight's conversation, it is my honor to introduce our esteemed speakers. First, we have Dr. Josephine Kim, a senior lecturer of education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and Dr. Samuel Kim, an associate professor at Texas Women's University. We are so happy that they are here with us tonight. And thank you so much, Dr. Josephine Kim and Dr. Samuel Kim, for being here and sharing your expertise with us. Please join me in welcoming them as they lead through tonight's session and important discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Jiwon. When we were thinking about our Fireside chat series, one of the things we were thinking about was a lot of the questions that we've been getting from y'all, the audience and the community out there. And one of the biggest questions has been, how do we raise teenagers in 2024? I mean, if you just think about, you just have to open up a newspaper or a news feed and you just see a world that is so different from the ones that maybe you grew up in way back in the day. I remember that when I was growing up in a small city in Georgia, uh, I would come home from school. I would immediately go outside, play with my friends. We would even go into the woods that were in our backyard and literally gone for hours until the sun went down without a cell phone, without any tracking devices. There was no air tag on me at all. And my parents weren't worried. They never told me, don't go out, don't go play with your friends. It was just a thing that we did. But that's so different today because that's not something that happens anymore. And Joe, remind me, you have a teenage son at home, right? Have you noticed some interesting differences between him growing up today and like what you experienced
Oh,
back when you were younger?
oh my goodness. I just keep laughing because one, I'm just exhausted. I'm sure a lot of folks, if you're a parent, you're showing up here very exhausted. So I just want you to know I'm one of them. Yeah, my son actually turned 13 last Friday, so he's a bona fide teenager. I know. And actually on his birthday, we were just thinking about, my gosh, what it took to get this child to the age of 13, right? My gosh. But yes, going back to your question, I think so many things are just so different. And I would love to invite the audience. I mean, what do you think is different for teenagers today? I would love to see, you interact with us in the chat. Would love to see some of your comments. But one of them, honestly, is I can't understand what they're saying. I mean, they've got a whole different language. I yesterday was carpooling with a bunch of seventh grader smelly basketball players, and they kept saying that my driving was mid, and I'm like, driving is mid. Like, what do you mean? And they're like, it's like middle. It's not like good. It's not bad. It's just middle. Or
Wow.
I'll do something and they're like, oh, that's negative aura, right? Like I've lost aura because like, they just speak a different language. And honestly, sometimes I'm really lost in what they're saying. I have no clue. And it made me realize, my gosh, for a lot of us, our immigrant parents really couldn't help us navigate because they never kind of were raised here during their, childhood and adolescence, and they didn't understand the US school system. People like me who was raised and went through the US school system, I almost can't help my child navigate because he's speaking a different language. So that's just one of them for sure. But Sam, I'm seeing some really fun things in the chat.
Oh my gosh, yes. Oh, phones, definitely. Like the way that we have that cell phones are so ubiquitous. They're just everywhere. And all of the social media stuff. One of the things that shocked me recently was a friend that was sharing about her teenage son got a job at this comic book store where they had like some card games like Magic Gathering and such there. And his job was to go there, turn on this camera on his phone, probably, and open up packages for people to buy. Like they were on like this online site that they go to, and that was his job, was to provide commentary and
Mm.
open up these things. I thought, I would have never imagined such a job, even a part-time job, uh, as a teenager back in my day. I would think it's like, no, you need to go to a restaurant, ask if they need help, and get an
Um,
application, fill it out, and you might be a waiter.
that's the thing, it's just so different. My goodness. I mean, we're seeing the phones, jobs are different. Again, when it comes to career development, right? The skills that we would assume they need in the future to be a great employee might be quite different than what we know from our past and even from our current lives. I'm also seeing the influence of social media.
Oh my
It's like,
gosh.
how much as a parent can you control? Right? I have to be honest, I went down the policing route, right? So the child got a phone. Honestly, it really was because I found out you can connect it to your own phone through Apple ID and all of these things. I can figure out where he is, by locate your phone, find my phone. But, and you can also control like what age appropriate apps, the child can access, etc. And you can kind of shut it down on your phone, right? And they would have to like send you a request if they wanted more time, etc., etc. All of that is great, but it's so exhausting, first of all. Secondly, it was like learning a whole new language. I mean, the learning curve to figure out how to do this stuff. I literally had to study. I don't think I studied that hard in grad school, And you had to try it over and over and over again to make sure it worked. And kids are so smart. They can find ways all around it, and you're
I
like
was about to
shocked.
say, by the time you figure out how to control something or lock something down, they'll figure out how to open it back up within a couple of days because knowledge is at our
Yes.
fingertips now. They can Google things. I think that was one of the most shocking things that I experienced. I mean, they're not quite adolescents anymore, but in the undergraduate classroom, I would ask a question to the class, and all these phones are like computers, and they start typing. It's like, oh, this is the answer. And it's just like, oh, I was going to assign this as a reading today.
Yeah, I mean, one of the fundamental questions, Sam, I think for me, I had to just kind of stop myself and ask was how much of this policing am I really capable of doing? Right? Like, can I really do this all the time? And also, what does my child lose when I am so like hyper policing all the time? And is there a certain point where you have to say, okay, something internally, like this has your own conviction, right? Is it a
Mhm.
better use of my time to have a conversation about why we actually don't want to consume everything we're seeing, right? On the web and social media, et cetera, et cetera? Or is it better to police? And I think I learned earlier on that, it's better to have these conversations so that we can grow this kind of inner conviction, right? Where they can police themselves. Now that's hard and it takes so much consistency and it takes lots of frustrating conversations through language that I don't understand, right?
It's
Um,
so difficult because, I mean, if we take a step back and think about what it is that you're policing as a parent, you're
mm,
policing information that is coming at these kids. And at one point in time, like I would say, even my generation, when we were growing up, it wasn't hard to police it because there was one TV in the living room and the parents could easily see what I'm watching and say like, oh no,
right.
you can't watch that, or like, flip to another channel, you can watch something different. But now they're getting so much information in such a personal device. even if you could see everything your child saw, do you have the hours in the day to go through everything that they've seen and make a decision
Right.
and curate what needs to be blocked and what things should be allowed? And that's
Um,
incredibly difficult to do as a parent, on top of all of the other demands that a parent has.
it's so true. And one thing that I'm really just amazed by is the capacity of these young teenagers, right? So I imagine for older teenagers, their capacity is even greater. But I'm really amazed by the young teenagers who have the capacity to actually like listen and understand and also contribute to that conversation, right? So
Mm.
I don't know about all of the parents in the room, but in fifth grade, here comes that health class, right? Where they start introducing things that make parents cringe, you know what I mean, right? They separate the boys and the girls and, have that conversation. And in essence, I mean, it's great that we're giving them this information, but not every child matures at the same time. So it's really challenging when a child really was not ready to hear that stuff, right? And so, in essence, what it does is it almost piques their curiosity, right? And so, what do you do when you're naturally curious? You're going to go seek that information. Um, and so there was a phase where there was a lot of that curiosity going on, right? I was listening to those conversations and trying to make sense of what, fifth and sixth and seventh graders were talking about. And certainly it was all embedded throughout. And Sam, again, I had to kind of sit and think, okay, put on your clinician's hat, put on your parent hat, put on your scholar's hat, put on your, there are no answers sometimes. But it really was about what if I sat with these kids, right? Got parents' permission to have a conversation with not just my child, because he's going to be influenced by the peers in such a strong way. So, what if I had a conversation with my child and the group of his peers, and we actually use like a book? And there was a great book on how pornography, right, actually
Mm.
reconfigures your brain, and it was really powerful, right? So I sent it out to like the friends' parents. I said, I would love to have a conversation about this. Can we all read it in our homes so that we know what it says, right? And then we could have this conversation. And I
Yeah,
can tell you, it made a huge difference. It's like
really.
when they realize how addictions form in the brain, that it's not even necessarily about you as a person, but our biology gets changed, right? And how when certain things are ignited in the brain, it sparks like an addictive, right? Like characteristic
Oh,
that it
yeah.
really is out of their control. And it was really amazing to watch them like kind of let this information soak in. And I thought, my gosh, how many times do we not have these conversations because we ourselves are so uncomfortable? And how often do we tend to minimize their capacity to actually learn and just absorb and to sit with the stuff? Um, yeah, and so all those hard questions about, well, you know what, if they're gonna go and get this information from strangers or people who actually don't care about them, right? So they'll share it in ways that, again, they don't have your child's best interest at heart, then is it really maybe better for me, even though it might be uncomfortable, to have that conversation? I would say 100% yeah.
Yeah, I think you're hitting on the core of what's so important, because you can't filter everything for your kid. You can't be there to protect them from everything. But what you can do as a parent is to provide that teachable moments, like providing them an
Mhm.
opportunity to kind of talk through something, and for them to see is like, oh, why is this okay and why is this not okay? And being able to connect at that level. I think, one of the things that I've heard a lot of parents share with me is their concerns about phones at the dinner table, at home, on vacation, on road trips. It's, how do I connect with my teenage child? Like, how do I get them to talk or give me a response that's more than, yeah, no? Or maybe you're in a home with a teenager who just grunts at you, go, and it's like, how do I make that connection? I think having those conversations about something that piques their curiosity, and opens up some of these other doors. Like, amongst like my generation, one of the things that I started to think about and gaining interest in is thinking about my family and just the stories that I don't know from my own family.
Mm,
And that's helped me to kind of disconnect because this is not something I can look up on the internet. This is not something I can find on Google. And next year, my family will be celebrating its 50th year of immigration to the US.
mm,
And I just thought, this is family history that no one else knows about. And so, how can I connect this with some of my younger cousins and actually my nieces and nephews now who are now in those
mm,
teenage years and like bring that kind of significance and meaning and having those kinds of conversations with them so that they can connect with something more than just the junk food of information that comes through all the social media sites and such.
mm. Oh goodness. Yeah, I really just coming back to the fundamentals of what's really important in life. I think when there's so many distractions, it's very easy. And, I'd be the first to admit, there are times when I only see my child for dinner. Things are just so busy already, right? If your child plays sports, if your child does other, extracurriculars, honestly, it's like dinner, shower, and sleep, right? Um, and so much of that, it's like, wow, I'm outsourcing quite a bit of my parenting to teachers, to after school activities, to coaches. I mean, so much of that. And can we come back to these fundamentals, like you're saying, right? The things that really matter at the end of the day. I think for me, Sam, one thing that's coming to mind as well, like how do you have a conversation about like pornography and the impact on the brain without having a relationship with your child? You can't. You really
No.
can't, right? I mean, those things are awful and uncomfortable things to talk about in the first place. But if they don't know, right, that you as a parent really care about them, that you do have their best interest at heart, that you actually spend some time with them, not necessarily because you're watching over their shoulders to see what they're doing and how much homework they got and all of these other things, but yeah, it just brings me back to that relationship because the quality of that relationship indirectly and directly impacts so many other things, including our children's mental health. And again, if we want to have these deep conversations, especially about cringy things, especially with our teenagers, where by the way, at that age, they are supposed to move away from us, right? And that's a hard thing we have to just kind of accept. They're moving away from us, their peers feel so important. So, how do we honor and respect that developmentally that's where they are and also right cultivate a relationship that can actually serve as a cushion, a nice cushion for these really rough conversations.
That sounds like the heart of a question of so many parents of teenagers these days. It's how do I connect with my teenager? Because there's so many things that I want to and need to talk to them about, and these topics, as you said, are uncomfortable because you think it's like, oh, I'll talk to them next week about that. Next week comes
Mm,
around, next month. I need to look up a few things. I want to see how different people explain. And then it comes next year, and then before you know it, they've left at home. They're out in college.
mm,
They're at university. They're moved to a different city for one reason or another. And you've kind of lost that opportunity for a little while to connect with them in that
mm,
manner. And what I will say to that is you can't start off by jumping into the deep end with a relationship. If you don't have a relationship established, um,
mm,
that conversation is going to be as awkward and awful as you are imagining, and probably worse. And
mm,
that said, I will say, like, if it's a very imminent and dangerous situation, of course, you need to have that conversation then and there. But if it's just about connecting with your child, it starts with little things. Earlier you were talking about how you attempted to kind of go at your teenage son and like trying to police all the things that come on in. Well, now you become a punitive agent. It's like, oh, I gotta hide things from mom before, she finds out. Otherwise, I
yeah,
can't go to my friend's house this weekend, or I can't take the car somewhere. And that makes it very, very difficult. So when
mm,
you connect with your child, what is it that you want to connect with them on? Do you want to connect with them on all the bad, horrible things in life so that they're most salient memories with you and conversations with you were all about all of these bad, awful things that are in the world? Or do you want to talk to them about the history of like how you grew up, what your parents were like, what your hometown was like, if you were the one who immigrated, how scary that must have been. And there's such simple questions that I think our and the previous generation don't think about that are at the forefront of the minds of the newer generation. For example, I have always wondered, how did my parents know to register for me for school? They had no internet. How did they read all of those forms and things they had to fill out on me for those schools? They didn't have, a phone with Google Translate on it or some sort of translation thing. And at the time, my family had this giant Korean English dictionary. I just could not see my dad carrying that around. And it just really brought me back to, it's like, well, how did you figure it out? What did you have to do to get through that? Um, but yeah, starting off with just little things like hobbies or talking about your experiences. I know growing up, one of the questions that annoyed me so much was when my mom would ask, "오늘 뭐 먹었어?" or like, "What did you have for lunch at school today?" I found it really annoying because I had all these meaningful interactions with teachers. We played these games with my friends, and I read this story, and she wants to know what I ate for lunch. And looking back on that, I can see that my immigrant mother was just wondering, it's like, what do American kids eat? Because she didn't have a YouTube channel to like watch and see what different lunches look like across the world.
Mm,
And of course, we know that in Korean American culture, that's sort of a way of saying I love you and showing concern in the way they did. But what happens if you today ask a question like, hey, what made you feel good today? Or what made you smile today? Did anyone or anything make you laugh? And oh my gosh, that can open up so many different doors.
yeah. I mean, there are times when they'll say, "Mom, not now," right? And that, I get that response quite a bit too. But yes, I think the quality of the questions that we ask, it's almost like if they only have a tolerance to get one or two questions from you, right? It's like, don't we want to make that good? Right? Do we really want to say like, do you have a lot of homework? Did you do well on that test? Or do we want to really get to the heart of the matter, right? I think the hardest thing for me as a parent is, gosh, I haven't seen you all day. I want to hear everything that happened about everything and about everybody, right? And there are times when teens, they really just cannot control their moods, right? Or they are just kind of at the end of their rope because maybe they were taxed all day, right? And finally,
Mhm.
they feel comfortable enough to be able to say, "I don't want to respond to that." Or my son will often say, "Sorry, the shop is closed." Right? That means like the shutters are down, like the shop is closed. Don't talk to me. And it's so hard not to say, "Oh, come on." Like, "Oh, come on, spend 5 minutes with me," at those moments. But to actually be okay with that, and then just leave it open. It's almost like giving them my son's a basketball player, so leaving the basketball in his court and
Mhm.
saying, "Okay, well, when you feel like it, you mind sharing later?" Just kinda leaving that open, so now it's totally in his court. If he wants to talk about it and bounce that ball around, great, and come my way, even better. But if not, then I know there's also a chance. But yeah, it's so
Mhm.
hard not to take those things so personally as a parent. And I can tell you when culturally there's like I'm Korean American, so that when there's that Korean piece of me that's like, "Oh, this feels like disrespect. This child just disrespected me right now." That can take on a whole different part of taking things personally. And so I try to keep those things in check for myself and to say, "Okay, yeah, sometimes we don't feel like talking." Right? And then I try to move on.
Yeah, and that is so hard because one, you're like trying to make forward progress with your child. At the same time, you're trying to hold back a part of you and this kind of weird feeling that you're getting inside. Going
Um,
back to talking about the social media, I see a comment in the chat box that's talking about, what do we do? Like, how do I tell my kid about the addictiveness of social media and like being on these phones and such? It's like, they're getting such massive shots of like dopamine and serotonin to different parts of their brain that's lighting up these reward centers. And there was a brief period of my training where I worked at a community mental health clinic and I saw a lot of folks with drug addictions. And let me tell you, the one thing that I know would not work is to tell them to stop doing it.
Mm,
I know for a fact that that wouldn't have worked with any of the clients I was working with at the time. And it's this cold turkey stopping is just impossible to do such a massive change in one's life.
mm,
One of the most effective ways of doing behavior change is to replace it with something. And so that's why you see a lot of folks who are chronic smokers, they'll chew gum. Or, you'll see people who drink a lot of alcohol, they'll drink soft drinks or these
mm,
non-alcoholic mocktails and such. And so if they're not going to be on their phone, what else are you going to offer them?
mm,
Are you ready to connect with them and do something? Like I remember growing up, one of my fondest memories I had with my father was he was an incredible paduk player. So he played Go, the board game, and I hope he never watches this. He was an awful teacher. So I never quite learned how to play the game from him. So we ended up playing Omok, which is just like getting five in a
On
row.
night
But that was
five,
a
yeah.
fond memory. We literally spent hours playing Omok together. And I wasn't watching TV. I wasn't playing my video games. I was just there playing with my dad, laughing with him, and just getting excited about these little pebbles on a piece of wood.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, we might call that like habit reversal training, right? So if I
Mhm.
know a child gets anxious and they're pulling their hair out because they're so anxious, then we literally want to give them something that they can do where it's physically impossible for them to reach up and pull their hair, right? So maybe it's like, doing this with two stress balls, or again, it's habit reversal training, but I think that's exactly right. I mean, I can tell you my son plays a ton of sports
Mhm.
and I love it. Why? Because we know they're so active, especially for boys at that age. They also need the regulation that comes from the exhaustion of sports, right? So they need to kind of like expend all that energy. Otherwise, they'll channel it into something you really don't want to know about, right? And so it's
Mhm.
really cool that he's involved in all of these things. But I think this is the key. He hates individual sports. He will
Oh,
not
really?
touch tennis. He will not touch golf. He will not touch. Guess why?
I have no clue. Why?
Because he doesn't do it with friends. It's missing the social aspect. So you put him on a basketball team, you put him on flag football, right? You put him on like ultimate throwing frisbees. Anytime there's a social component to it and he's part of a team with friends, oh my goodness, talk about another addictive piece. I would say that's more enjoyable, at least for my child, than it is to sit around playing video games. Even when he plays video games, parents might notice this. It's always with friends online. It's never alone. It's not like, us parents in the bathroom doing the, I don't know what we play, you know? But it's always connected to some sort of social network. And to me, I find that beautiful.
Yeah, I saw a comment earlier in the chat box that was talking about how COVID had changed
Yes.
everything. And
Right.
I mean, there were a lot of horrible things that happened during that time. But one of the nice things is just how comfortable people got to connect over the internet. I mean, I do credit our ability to have these virtual events through MSG because of what happened through COVID. Like, this was an
Mm,
opportunity that arose because so many people became comfortable with it. And speaking
mhm,
about these games online, there's so many video games that allow for this online connection with others. And a lot of them are marketed towards that. There's a whole genre of games where you play with other people online. And it's not just, oh, they're this little character here and there, that little character there, and you're doing something
mm,
together. You can actually talk with one another, live as you're
right.
doing things. You can even see each other through the various technologies that are available. And I think once upon a time there was a stigma about having friends online, like people that you meet in like I can't remember what chat groups back then and message boards and IMs and good old AOL way back in the day. But that has changed significantly. There's a lot more people that are online. And the way I kind of think about it for teenagers is one of the core important things that teenagers are looking to do is figure out who they are. That identity discovery
Right.
piece of just like, who am I? And, what is my kind of niche or role in my family, friends, the world? And back in the day, you had to be lucky to find people with similar interests around you in your local area. But
Mm.
today, let's say you like this really niche, obscure video game. There's this whole world of people who like that obscure niche video game and are enjoying it just like you. Or maybe there is that popular video game that they like to play in a certain way. And now we got all of that going on. So it's a great way for people to
Right.
connect with interests. And that's not to say it's without dangers or anything, but it still can be a very positive experience.
And I see a comment here from, even Kristen who's saying, well, when do you actually get them a phone? Like, when are they ready and when is holding off hurting them and their ability to be social? You definitely, I volunteer for a lot of carpooling because that's when I really get to see how my child is with, his friends,
You are brave.
and hear all these languages. And let me tell you, during the teen years, they stink. Like hormonally, they just smell so bad. But I allow this and I actually ask for it because it's such a great window into how your child is. And they almost forget you're there, right? You're kind of like the chauffeur doing the driving, but they almost forget you're there. But Kristen, going back to your question about when are they ready? Yeah, I think they're ready when they can actually express to you and articulate to you their sense of responsibility, right, with these devices. I think they also have to be very informed, meaning, when you have a phone, these are all the things that come with it, right? Here are all the great things you might gain, but here are all the detriments as well. And so you tell me how you're going to then use this, right? Instead of us saying, well, I think you should only have 1 hour of this and 1 hour of that and not be able to access this and this. Trust me, I tried that. But instead, it's almost like, well, you tell me how you plan to use it. And let's see if we can come to a consensus, right? To a point where we can agree on whatever it is. And Chris and I have seen it in those carpools where all the other kids are connected on their phones and playing to de-stress after a losing game, and that one kid doesn't have that phone, right? And there's only so much you can say about, well, make sure everybody has a phone or nobody gets to play, right? There's only so much you can do. Of course, in my car, we say, well, make sure we're sharing our devices and doing all that stuff. But going back to Lori's question too about, well, yeah, how do you navigate the balance between respecting your teen's privacy and ensuring their safety online? Because my child is only just freshly 13, he actually cannot connect to strangers. All of the devices are set up in such a way that you can only connect to people who are contacts in your phone. And, right, he needs my permission to actually add a new contact, right? And so, because again, he's 13 and I'm able to kind of set those parameters, but really, I think they enjoy it when they're friends already and they're right playing on the same device or whatever, however they do it. Um, but I guess as a parent, another advice I might have is, for a while I tried another thing too, like, okay, well, you have to do your homework, you earn, 20 minutes, right? Like you practice your Korean, you can earn another 10 minutes. Right? But I can tell you that too becomes really, really exhausting. And what's great is when I know that he's worked really hard on a certain week, like our house, you cannot play games during the week. Right, that's just a thing because you've got so many other things to do, right? But on the weekends, if I know he's worked hard all week, then actually I'm the first one to say, "Hey, why don't you go play for like an hour?" And his eyes will get this big. He's like, "What?" Right? So I'm like, "Yeah, you work so hard. I think you deserve it." Right? Yeah. Why
I
not?
feel like if there are any
Um,
teenagers listening right now, they're gonna be like, "Hey, can you talk to my mom?"
that's why they have a name for me, but I forget what the language is. Anyway, it's supposed
Oh,
to mean
good.
cool mom, right?
So you're definitely not
But
mid as a mom. Got it.
well, I don't know. They're very fickle. But
Yeah, I
but
think that's such a
yeah.
big question that Lori is asking, and I love the way that you touched on it. It's like, how do I do this balance? It's like, I do want them to kind of grow in their own lives and, develop with their peers and, take advantage of all the wonderful things that are in the world. And yet,
Mm,
how do I protect them? And one of the issues with that protection piece or keeping them safe is, what are you keeping them safe from? I mean, we can sit here and catastrophize all day long, but it's kind of hard for us to specifically identify the exact dangers that are facing our children. And because there's just so many of these different things, I kind of think of it in this way. Is it more that you're not sure that your child shares the values that you have, and so they're not capable of doing that filtering?
mm,
Or is it that you yourself aren't able to trust your child to make decisions for themselves? And so it
mm,
kind of brings the question to, is this an issue that lies more with the child, the teenager, or is it something that lies more with us being on the parent side of that?
mm,
And that's a lot of soul searching and digging and
yeah.
thinking. And, before we start making this too complicated and going down the philosophy path and all of that, I do want to point out, I loved what you said earlier, Joe, um, about how you allow your kid just to have this free time out there and that there are different ways that you connect with them. And I think that's really nice because if you have those connection points, even just being carpooling, sure, you're a chauffeur, but I'm sure there are times when he's like mentioned something to you at that time in passing
Oh yeah.
that keeps the lines of communication open.
Totally, and for the longest time too, like, we would do audiobooks in the car. So I'm one of those parents, I feel reading out loud with our kids is so important, doesn't matter how old they are, and so we still do it. Not as regularly, I would say, but it's still really valuable, I think. And you really have to be strategic about the things you bring into, right, the house, like certain books, what it touches upon, like how it's gonna open doors for conversation. Even in counseling, right, Sam? I mean, half of the things, or I would say all of the things, interventions, assessments, tools, techniques, anything we bring in and of itself is not so valuable. It's really what it does to open up that door for conversation. And so all of it is kind of approached that way. But going back to what you're saying, oh my goodness, as a parent, I feel like so much of what we have to do is ask those really hard questions like, for whose benefit am I so angry right now at what just happened? Right? And for whose benefit did I just put all of these regulations on, this child? Was it for him and his benefit, or was it really just to get myself some satisfaction in the moment and exert some control? And I can tell you that's a tough, tough one. And again, those cultural norms will come in where you're like, hierarchical, like I'm Korean and you're really pushing on my right, like cultural expectations right now. But that's a hard conversation I probably have with myself constantly. And I went as far as to even think for myself, Sam, what would I do if this was a friend's child over at my
Mm.
house? Right? Would my words change? Would I approach this child differently? Right? And the answer is completely differently. I know I would. Right? And so
Yeah.
that's a technique I have for myself, Sam. Right? I'm like, you're raising a child, but they're not your own. Right? Like, always think they're somebody else's child. Like, how would you, react and talk and behave in that case? And I know I'm completely different.
And it is that principle that I have so much love for teachers and educators because they're essentially with your children for
Mm,
most of the day. And they're essentially other people's children that they are now have responsibility for. You have now entrusted them with their education and to a degree, they're raising, like how they're being reared in those
mm,
environments. Oh, the other thing that I wanted to mention from your story that you were sharing with your son is that there is that desire to kind of just like pass down the command. It's like, this is the rule, my house, my rules. We're going to do it
Right.
this way. Um, Sorry, I keep thinking about my parents and I just hope they never listen to this. But one of the rules that my father had when I was growing up was you are not allowed to speak English in the house. You can
Hmm.
speak English anywhere else you'd like, but not in the house. And I just remember it's like, why do we have this rule? This is such a stupid rule. Why can't I speak English and Korean at the same time? And what you did with your son was you kind of gave him ownership. You were having that conversation. It's like, what is like, okay, you want to get a phone. Like, how do you want to use it? What is it that you want to use it for? Are you able to tell what's good and not good in the usage of it? And what that does is instead of bringing down a command where their frustration and anger is geared towards the one who brought down the command, now it's a conversation the two of you have, and now both of you have ownership over this decision. And so now they share in that responsibility.
Yeah, and I keep going back to counseling skills in some ways because parenting, I feel like we all need to implement counseling skills. But one of the things we don't do in counseling is we don't give advice, right? Especially to young people, we don't give advice. And some parents might be shocked by that, but counselors actually, when done right, we don't give advice. And it's because you could give advice. And if it goes well for that person, then guess what? They'll come back for more advice, right? And then they become very dependent on you. So with
Yeah.
everything, they'll come back and check and they'll get your permission and they'll get your approval. And that too is very exhausting. And if our goal actually is for our children to do life on their own without us, eventually, right? We're not going to be there forever. Then I don't know if that's the best way to parent. Also, let's say we give them advice and it doesn't go well, then guess who are they going to blame? Exactly. They'll come back and say, "What you told me did not work." Right? And so
Well,
really
it
a
wasn't
good
my advice. Someone named Dr.
yeah,
Sam and Dr. Joe told me to do it.
yeah. So part of what we do is instead of giving advice, it's getting them, as we were talking about, to come up with their own solutions, right? So how will I know? What will show me that you're using your phone responsibly? So I know for a fact, right, that you have the maturity and the responsibility, right, to handle this device. And then they're able to list for you exactly what would show you, right? And what they can show about their responsibility. um, I think for parents and for counselors, honestly, we take the stance of unknowing quite a bit. You might know a lot, but we still take the stance of unknowing. Gosh, I'm really confused about the situation. Can you tell me what you thought about it? Right? Gosh, I really don't know what to do about this situation. Can you tell me what you might do in this situation? So it's taking stance of, the unknowing, like I know, but I'm actually not really in the know and I need your help, right? Because there is so much that we don't know about what their lives are like. We talked about it, we started in the beginning. Their lives are just so completely different. It's true. And the hard part about it is we don't even know what all of those differences are. That's the
Yeah,
hard part.
it's so different. Like I would love to show your teenage son a rotary phone and see how he would dial a number. Or to just be able to ask him, hey, you've seen the save button in like Microsoft Word. What do you think that's a picture of?
Mm,
Just thinking about little things like that it's such a different world. But I think, yeah, within counseling and therapy, the analogy I usually give to my clients is I'm not here to tell you how to live your life. I'm literally here for a road trip through your life, and I'm going to be a passenger. And as a good passenger, I'm going to ask about things. I'm going to point out things. It's like, hey, why are we taking this exit and not that one? What's going on over here?
mm,
Oh, this looks just like the place we were just at. And seeing those connections and how they come together tells me a lot about the client, especially what they share with me and what they don't share with me. And going back to talking about, the whole situation with the phones or what boundaries you want to set up with your child or your teenager, it's a question of values, I think. It's what are my child's value? What are my teenagers' values? Like, what are the things that are a priority to them? And are they in line with, similar, parallel, or completely perpendicular to my values? And I think that's a big question to ask because, we were talking about, there was questions about how to use different things, what sort of conversations to have about sensitive topics. There's questions about faith, sharing faith, and like, what happens when the parents are devout Christians and the child's not, or the teenager is not, doesn't want anything to do with it. It's, are you two completely divergent, or is there a separate reason for that out there? And to be able to have that
Mm,
conversation and explore it where they have ownership over something, they now will take responsibility for it. And I want to transition to this question from Kristen. It's,
mm,
well, I think one of the things that people love giving opinions about outside of politics and sports is parenting. If you just get a group of adults together and someone asks a question about parenting and there's 10 people there, you will get 20 different opinions about what you should do in that situation. And so how do you balance all of these different influences and all these different messages, whether explicit or implicit, Joe, about raising your child? Like, how do you
Ooh,
filter through all of that?
yeah. I mean, I think this is why we have to know our children well, right? Um, and until they can become their own experts, right? Which we really badly hope that they will, right? Until that, we have to be their experts, right? Until they can become their own. And I think we do know our children fairly well, but that means we have to study them. Like, how do you get to know anything well? You have to study them. You have to, spend time with them. You have to get to know them. You have to hear from them, and you have to sit in their presence. All of those things I think are required to actually know our children because only when we know our children their natural personalities, right? Um, what they appreciate, what they don't appreciate, how much of something they can take and how much they can't take, this type of thing. Then I think we can only then kind of parent in the way that works for that child. Right. This is why parents with multiple kids will say they all came from the same like tummy, but they're all completely different. And, depending on what you know about each child, you have to parent differently, not one thing. There isn't, I think that's why it's so hard. There isn't that guidebook, with the 10 steps and it works for every single child. It really doesn't, right? And again, I think we have to study and get to know them, just like we might study a puzzle or, learn how to cook. Like everything is a process. And that's a really important word for parents. And one of the hardest things about parenting, this is both kind of a statement on reality and also an encouragement to us, is that we don't quite see the fruits of our labor until decades later. And I think that's the hardest thing. It's not like instantaneous. I did something really well, and then boom, they give us that fruit, right? And because it's a process, it's so easy to want to have one single conversation and everything be flipped around or everything goes well. It just won't, right? And so I think the sooner we can kind of accept that it'll be messy, that it'll be a long process, that it's never going to be that one clean cut conversation with my child about that one thing, but it's really going to be a long, drawn out process. I think that actually helps us to pace ourselves, and to really pick and choose your battles too. If a lot of parenting, it can be really difficult when we're seeing everything and we choose to address everything. I really have to pick and choose. Sometimes it's like, okay, what's the top thing that feels really important versus everything else that can kind of go to the wayside for now, right? And I think that helps me to pace my parenting. That also helps my child so that I don't push him over the edge, right? With a list of 10 things that I want him to change, right? Oh, but the
Yeah,
fact that
and
it's
I
a
think
process. Mhm.
that's such an important point to bring up because I think a lot of the conversation we've been having right now is from the parent's perspective. It's, can I trust my kid? Do I believe that they have the values and that they can navigate through some of these dicey, sketchy things that are out there? I think at the same way, if you are wanting to build this connection with your teenager, they're also assessing, can I trust you? And it's not that, oh, are you a trustworthy person? It's more of, can I trust you to listen to some of these contemporary issues that you might not have experienced when you were younger? Like, are you able to really deeply connect with that? Or are you going to immediately dismiss it and say, no, that's bad, don't do that again? And I think that's also there's also a negotiation of trust that's happening on both ends with that. I also
Mhm.
love, and I think this is a great thing for some parents out there to try if they're willing to. You're talking about like in therapy, we kind of come in not knowing. And one of the terms that we use when I train students is kind of have like a one downsmanship. So it's not a one upsmanship, it's one downsmanship. And what that means is you're kind of coming in a little bit more humbly and asking questions and just being naturally curious about things because goodness gracious, we were talking earlier. We have no idea what they're saying. These teenagers can literally have a whole conversation, and we would only be able to pull out a couple of words. It's a different language out there. And so, coming in with that curiosity and really trying to understand, I think will speak volumes and build the kind of trust that you're wanting to build with your teenager.
And when you listen to them, it's both hilarious and kind of shocking, right? I mean, and as a parent and educator, you're so tempted to say, well, we shouldn't talk badly about other people, but they will tear their teachers down and they will, just talk smack about every single person. But I think in those moments, I try to just kind of absorb it and say, wow, if every single child is saying the same thing about this one particular, teacher, then we kind of have to wonder too, right? But anyway, I guess the point for me is to again pick and choose our battles, but if we're really kind of approaching them as an ally, like on their side, and not somebody who's constantly like, oh, you shouldn't say that, like, oh, you shouldn't have done that. And trust me, they are so savvy and so smart, they know. Right, they already know so much, and so I think it's a matter of, as you said, are you trustworthy? Because they're gonna think, right? That is a question we get often. Like, what makes you different than any other adult who's trying to control my life, right? And why should I listen to you? And so I think that piece is important. But as a parent, it also means that, you mentioned humility. Wow, I had no I can apologize so easily to so many people, but whoo, apologizing to my child is tough. I don't know if it's that Koreanness in me that comes out at those moments, right? But even if it is an apology, sometimes it's like apology plus 10 reasons why I did it. And we know those are not effective apologies, right? And so a big part of what I've had to learn is truly authentically and very transparently apologize for something and just say, "I'm sorry," and let it go. Instead of providing all these excuses for why I did it and why I'm still right, even though I'm apologizing, right?
And
And
I
I've
want to give
seen
space. Oh, go
mhm.
ahead.
No, I was gonna say, I feel like that's changed our relationship quite a bit.
I was going to say that, yes, that kind of relationship building is so important. It's like, how do you pull that together and kind of create space with your son and develop that trustworthiness with them? And once you kind of get the ball rolling and trying with small things, you can get to the point where you're having a lot of these difficult conversations with one another. There was another point I was going to make, and it just left my mind.
Well, Sam, we could also talk about, my gosh, as a parent, we also need to know when we need help.
Yes.
Yeah.
And oh my gosh, there are so many other resources. One of the things that there's so much research out there that I've kind of gotten to the point where I'm preaching this just about everywhere I go. Anyone going through any difficulty in life, or even if life's going well, social supports are one of the most powerful things that you can have. And we mentioned earlier, and all the parents out there know that's true. You can't be there 24/7 for your kid. especially if they're teenagers and building relationships. So, where do you turn and how do you kind of find these kinds of social supports? Well, for the teenager, they're going to find it in lots of different places. We've been talking about peers, but they'll also find mentors. They'll find particular teachers that they become close with. Believe it or not, I still keep in touch with my high school physics teacher, and I call her every now and then to just check in and see how things are doing. Growing up, when I was in college, I was a weirdo. I would call my komos, my aunts, and have conversations with them for hours. And then my conversation with my parents would last about 5 minutes. And
Hmm.
they'd mention these things here and there, and I know they were talking off to the side, but they were just sharing. It's like, yeah, he's doing okay. He's kind of worried about tests or whatever, and that brought some assurance to my parents to know that, oh, there are other people in my child's life who have similar values, and they are talking through some of these things because you just can't do it all yourself.
It's so true. I think we have to lean on other people, for us, I think coaches have been wonderful. And, if it's so easy as they get older, because now it becomes about just dropping them off at the entrance and they go off, do their thing, and then they come back and they hop back in the car and then you just bring them back. But yeah, take the time to go in, introduce yourself. And for me, it's a great time to say a little bit, about my child and say, oh, you might notice these types of things. And when you do, like, I'd love it if you be able to share it with me or whatever that might be. And I think the whole culture of sports is not so centered on this type of, interactions, but just it's understanding what you just said, that there are other caring adults, right? And if you're also requesting that they do certain things for your child, I think they actually then will put up more antennas, right, when they're around your child as well. Same thing with teachers. I don't go in with the 10 things my child is great at. I go in with lots of things that they might struggle with my child, right? Very honest and authentically. And instead of saying, don't I think one thing that teachers also hesitate is parents have all sorts of reactions when they get emails or, calls from schools. But I'm very open in saying, please do not hesitate to contact me because I'd much rather know, right, than not know. Last year, we ended the school year with me getting an email from my son's teacher telling me that he pantsed someone.
Oh, wow. Oh my
And I
goodness.
thought, how does a word like pants become like a verb, like an action word? And so of course he comes home and I'm like doing deep breathing, like trying to calm myself down and making sure that I'm approaching this again, reminding myself if he was your friend's child, like how would you, react? And as soon as I saw him, I said, "So you panned somebody, huh?" And I couldn't help but laugh because it's like, how does that word become some sort of action, verb? And he's like, "Oh, mom." And he and he basically was like, "Oh my gosh, these adults making this thing like, a huge, small, molehill into a huge mountain." And he's like, "Mom, it's just something that we preteen boys do." He's like, "Don't worry, nobody was damaged. I wasn't damaged. Like nobody had a bad relationship with each other." And then, of course, hearing that all of a sudden made me feel much more relieved. But then, of course, as a responsible parent, you have to talk about why that was not so appropriate, right? How I appreciate, there was a professor of mine who would always talk about this thing called the healthy striving.
Healthy
And
scraping.
yeah, and she would talk about underneath every dysfunctional like decision or behavior or even words that there's a healthy desire that people are trying to get to, you know? And so even though what my child did, pantsing somebody, we could say was dysfunctional and not appropriate, but underneath that is this healthy striving of wanting to just stay so connected to his peers, right? There's also an element of wanting to kind of alpha up and be that sigma, again, their language, right? And so if that's the healthy striving, then hopefully as a parent, we can talk about how can you, right? Reach some of these healthy goals that you have and the things that you really do want. But how can we do that in a way that's not going to get you in trouble? That's not going to get you, scapegoated in the future, right? And known as a troublemaker at your school, et cetera, et cetera. And so that conversation ended up being very productive. And we still kind of laugh about him pantsing somebody last year. But that conversation ended up being very productive, and it really was because I was able to kind of keep the cool. I always tell beginning level counselors, one of the things we have to learn is just to stay very even keel.
Mm.
Somebody does super well, you still have to stay very even keel because we don't want them to feel like they always have to do well to come see us, right? When they do super bad, right, we still stay very even keel because we still appreciate them, respect them, right, and honor them and hold them to the highest esteem no matter what they've done. And I think that piece in parenting can be so, so valuable too.
Yeah, because we don't want to become their standard of living. And it's like, yes, to a degree,
Right.
you want them to have our values and your values to be set out
Mhm.
there. But you also don't want to be the micromanager of their lives where they have to come ask you
Mm.
permission for everything. Like, you don't want to be the parent where the kid has to ask you, is like, can I use, two more squares of the toilet paper today? You don't want to be
Mm.
that micromanaging
Yeah.
with them. You want
Right.
to make sure that they have the right principles to be out there. And I think this is also really tough to hear. They're going to make mistakes, and that's part of life. It's like those kids are going to make mistakes.
Yeah.
And they're going to have embarrassing moments. They're going to accidentally hurt other people's, where there's feelings or physically.
Yeah.
And you have to figure out like how you're going to navigate that in that time. But
Mm.
if you have if the teenager has a certain perception of you that's been built over time because they haven't really connected with you, then they're going to develop this perception of you where it's like, oh, I know what they're going to say. Oh, I know what they're like. And it just slowly starts skewing the longer you don't connect with them.
Mm.
Whereas if you
Yeah.
do have some sort of regular connection, I mean, this is something I recommend all the time, then there's a place to kind of reset that relationship. There's a place to like come back and like do something together, whether it's cooking. Like one of my fondest memories I have with my grandmother is she was having
Mm.
trouble cooking 된장찌개 one day. And so I learned how she makes 된장찌개. And so I'm currently the only one in my family that has my grandmother's recipe for our family's 된장찌개 because there was that one time I just happened to help her with it. And I think little instances
Beautiful.
like that are just so wonderful to have. It's like, are you going to connect and just be punitive and a manager? Or is there something more that you want to give them and for them to develop a relationship with you outside of just, is this good or bad? Is this right or wrong?
And it's really ironic, I look back on how I was parented, and one thing I never did with my parents is ask for permission to go somewhere. It was more like, this is where I need to go, and this is why, and this is when I'll be back. And it's so incredible to me looking back because the level of trust my parents gave me is unbelievable. But it's ironic because the more we do that, the more responsible a child feels to actually fulfill, right, that trust. And so that's something I'm really learning, oftentimes the hard way. But thank you for mentioning the 된장찌개, which is like the soybean soup, that's very
Mhm.
traditional in Korean culture, because I'm seeing a question here about how can parents help their children maintain pride in their cultural identity while navigating a globalized world, especially considering the impact of technology on young minds. Ooh, yes, that is one we are wrestling with, especially in a host culture that is so counter to, right, how oftentimes things are in the East, right? And even in our own families. Yeah. Do you want to
It's
start,
such
Sam?
Yeah, we have such a heterogeneous society. It's like, we have people from all sorts of different backgrounds. We have people who, even if they're not Asian or look Asian presenting, there's still a wealth of different cultures that are out there, even going beyond ethnicity. Like,
Mm.
if you talk to me from the deep south and meet someone from, let's say, New York City, we're going to have very different approaches to how we speak and how we communicate different things. And I think that goes back to, coming with that approach of humility, because these teenagers are growing up in a very different culture, and that culture is so divergent from things that we know today. So, how do
Mm.
you kind of maintain that cultural identity that's important for you? Maybe it's the language, the foods, or certain holidays that you want to pass down. In this world where they're being taught to appreciate everything, it's like, yes, appreciate everything, but also this little piece here is yours. If I would just come up with a suggestion off the top of my head, there's so many like wonderful like little Korean holidays out there. And my goodness, there are so many websites, including Wikipedia, that have explanations as to what they are. Like,
Mm.
what is Chuseok? What is Hangulnar? Why is this the day that's celebrated for the creation of the Korean language? Why was that created? And then you'll start going down that rabbit hole. If you can do
Mm.
that together and like look at, gaining information together on the internet, how wonderful it'll be. The two of you will be discovering things. And there might be certain memories that come up. For example, I haven't experienced this, but I bet if I do this with my parents and I start looking up Sejong Daewang, the King Sejong, and look up why he created the Korean language, I have a feeling they're going to start almost chanting the, what's it called, the preamble, the 훈민정음, the 우리나라 말씀이, that little thing, because so many Korean school children were taught to
Yeah.
memorize that when they were younger. And there's so many memories that are connected with that. Even sharing things like when my mother was in elementary school, there was a tteokbokki place like, right across the street, like most elementary schools had in that day. And she has these fond memories of just sweating bullets and eating this super spicy tteokbokki with her friends, where they, gather together their little allowances.
I love it. That's beautiful.
Yeah, how
Yeah,
do
I
you
mean, what
share
we
your culture with your son?
Yeah. I mean, what we know to be true about cultural identity, right? It has to be developed. You have to practice it. You have to have room to be able to develop and cultivate it. It doesn't happen just because you're Korean or just because you're, another racial group. And so I think as parents, we can be very intentional about how that becomes developed in our children. All of those things that you mentioned, Sam, are great examples of how we do this. I think what was important for me as a parent, knowing the cultural identity and the importance of it. First of all, can I just talk about the detriments of what happens when you don't have a strong cultural identity? One of the detriments is the literature talks about how you have a delayed onset of adolescence, right? Because all these things that you're supposed to practice, and this is where, I have to work with schools to be able to say, you have to represent my child in the curriculum. My child has to be able to learn his history, right? And see the contributions of his people in what you're teaching my child, just like you're teaching about everything else, right? And really kind of demanding, I think, this aspect of their education to be there, but knowing that this is something that's valuable to our children, right? But what can happen is if they're not given that space to develop it, then they actually wait till they're in college and they're on their own, right? Choosing an ethnic studies course on Asian Americans, for example. And for the first time, kind of having that choice to take the courses they want, and then kind of coming into the knowledge of what it could have been. I've had so many graduate students who come to me and they say, I didn't even know what I was missing. I knew something was missing, but I could not have told you what that was. I couldn't have named it for you, and now I know, right? But it's almost like a little bit too late. Um, and what I mean by that delayed onset of adolescence is what it means if you're doing that type of exploring in college and beyond when you really should have done it in your teen years, then now what you're supposed to move on to, which is like careers and life partners and your whole life trajectory, you can't quite move on because you're kind of stuck in that phase of adolescence in trying to figure out your identity. And so, all of that to say, it takes practice. We have to be intentional. In our home, very intentional about language. And so, most of the time, Korean is spoken. Um, not only because you're Korean and you have to speak Korean, but we would talk about how people gave their lives for this language to protect it. right? And it's really our responsibility to make sure it doesn't end with us, right? What people die to preserve, we are not going to be the ones to actually then nix that out of our lives, right? We're going to continue that legacy. And so speaking Korean is very important, right? The reading and writing, yes, I care about it, but probably not as much, right? But the communicating piece, the verbal
Mhm.
part feels very important. I also constantly think about a providing a counter narrative to what I know he's getting and not getting in the school in the
Mm.
United States, right? So if he's learning history about white America, I want to make sure I counter that narrative with lots of my own ethnic heritage and history, like you were talking about, Sam, right? I also want him to make sure he's having lots of counter experiences to what I know he's probably experiencing out in the mainstream education and media and all of those things, right? So again, being very intentional about having that counter experience. And it really is kind of a larger strategic way of doing counter conditioning because we all know children of color, right? Asian American children,
Mhm.
Korean American children, they go out into our host communities and they're not represented enough, right? They're not taught about their histories and the contributions of their forefathers, right? The way maybe Americans or Europeans might be. And so, because we know that's missing, I do think we have to amp it up in our homes and also work together with the school to make sure it's happening.
I want to let this idea marinate in our heads for a few more seconds. This idea that if kids aren't exposed to their home cultures, that they're kind of going to repeat or prolong their adolescence where they're struggling to figure out who they are. I think about like all the social media things that are out there, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and I feel like saying that that feels old and obsolete now. They have other platforms that are out there. But what's interesting about those accounts on all these different platforms is there's a very clear identity. Like they post things because they're about makeup, or, there's a YouTube channel. This is about cooking foods from a particular culture. And so I think subtly a lot of teenagers, as well as adults, are being pressured to kind of ask the question, well, what's your thing? Or who are you? What do you bring to this world? And if we are not providing for these teenagers an avenue to discover their own identities, they're going to feel like they're missing out on something. They're going to feel like something is a little missing in their life, and that can have a lot of detrimental effects.
Yeah, a scholar would say it's like looking in the mirror and not seeing anything, right? When you're not represented, and certainly that'll hurt our identities, right? But Sam, I also see a great question here. Do you have advice for parents who struggle with communicating with their children, especially due to constant fights and arguments?
Oh,
Whew, it's a tough one.
wow,
Yeah.
that is a really hard one. Um, I'm assuming that by the time this question gets asked, that all attempts to try to broker that line of communication have failed between the parent and the teenager. They've tried different things and it doesn't work. One of the things that I would suggest in that arena is, do you have a third party that can come in? Yeah. And a lot of folks will kind of think of that as like, that could be family counseling or family therapy that's out there. I also want to throw in that the school can be a resource in many different
Mm,
ways. And I want to take a brief detour to just explain that special education is not tuksugyuyuk, which is special education in Korean, because these are two very, very different ideas and principles. At least my impression, and kind of when I toured a special education facility in Korea, it's any student with a disability is sent to this whole separate facility. Whereas in the US, all children must receive an education or must have an opportunity to receive education in the public schools. Therefore, if you have special education services, these are services that allow you, a child, to kind of get closer to a level playing field with others. And a lot of people think learning disabilities and such But this can include social and emotional issues as well. Like if a kid's going through depression or anxiety that's preventing them from doing well in school, there are resources within the school. I would say the first point of contact should be the teacher, um, to kind of figure out, like, are there other things that we can do? They may refer you to a school counselor, which most schools have one or two that are housed there. And then my field is school psychology, which is also a little different. So, school psychologists are typically not employed by the schools, they're typically employed by the school districts. And one way that I put it is we're sort of the last resort. When no one else can quite figure out what's going on, then they'll come to the school psychologist. And what we do is we do lots of observations, we do a lot of assessments to kind of figure out what's going on and determine with the team and the family if this child's eligible for services. And that can include if there are certain, you know, depression is one of those things that can look like anger in teenagers. It looks a lot like irritability. So if that's something they're going through, then the school
Yeah.
can kind of help with that and provide some additional services
Mm.
there, whether it's a check-in with a particular teacher that they like to see, whether it's more time on different things, or providing counseling services within the schools. But having some sort of mediator, I think, is a big help if it's not going well with you and the kid.
Yeah, first, I just want to say this is such a thing that hits close to home for every single parent, especially when children, I think, are in the thick of their adolescence. And so, if you're finding that this is you as well, please know that you're not alone, that so many of us have those moments where it just feels impossible to have a loving relationship with our children because we love them so much, right? We also have high expectations and we want them to do well. And because we want them to do so well, it actually becomes even harder to watch them struggle. But I just want to say relationships are really all about patterns. And so if you're finding that because you're constantly arguing, that you can't really invest into the quality of the relationship, sit down and kind of figure out for yourself when those arguments happen. Is it when you're talking about academics, like schoolwork, homework, tests, right? Or is it when you're talking about friendships? Is it when you're talking about, I don't know what, hairstyle or way of dressing or whatever it might be? But try to figure out what those patterns are. And I would say, I know as hard as it is, try to not talk about that thing, right? Because it's almost like when we get into those patterns, you'll find yourself kind of stuck and you'll go down that same path every single time. And as Einstein said, right, we can't do the same thing and keep doing it and expect different results. You almost have to do something completely drastic. Drastic as in I no longer see that you've got 5 earrings, right? And that used to really bother me, but right now I'm choosing not to see that, right? But instead, you look beyond that for at least a little bit to then be able to converse, and your child will notice. That's the thing. Your child will notice, and believe it or not, as hard and the exterior of some teens can be so hard that it feels almost intimidating even for the parents. But I want you to know the harder the exterior is, at least from my counseling, right, for almost 3 decades now, right? The harder the exterior is, the softer and the more fragile the person is on the inside. Usually that's the case. And so, if you can ask yourself again, what is that healthy striving of this child? What is that heart's desire this child is wanting? Yes, it's not coming out the right way. Yes, it's dysfunctional in some ways. But what is that thing that they really want to try to accomplish or achieve? And let's see if, as a parent, and you can really kind of look beyond these things that act as triggers for that argument, right? And move beyond it. And as Sam suggested, sometimes we cannot do it on our own because these patterns become so deeply ingrained. In Korean, we might say like, "Oh, 마음은 안 그런데," our heart isn't like that, but it keeps repeating itself, right? And that's when we do need somebody else who might be able to say, "Wait, wait, 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 before you speak, let's let mom finish," right? Okay, mom, wait, 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 let's let your child finish, right? So we sometimes need that third person to mediate. And that's never a bad idea.
No, not at all. Oh my gosh, your comments making me think of so many different things. One in particular, in the few minutes we have left, uh, it in my classes, there's an exercise that I do. I bring in a completely made up kid, a scenario. His name's Caleb, and he's also a teenager. Just recently, let's say, got a Nintendo Switch or PlayStation 5. A student, all of a sudden, grades are dropping now to B's, C's. You actually saw a D on something that the kid
Mm.
brought home. And at night, the parents are struggling to get this kid to go to sleep because he will not go to sleep. And he always says, like, in 10 minutes, in half an hour, I'm going to turn, I'm almost done with this thing. And it's a daily battle. And when I do this talk with, parents are outside, I ask them, like, what should the parents do? And, I get great suggestions. A lot of them are like, let's set up boundaries. Let's talk to them about, how to control these different things. I also heard like hide the games, put them somewhere where they'll never look. But then I ask a question. It's like, would you respond differently if I told you that Caleb was having recurring nightmares? Would you respond differently if Caleb was being bullied at school and was afraid to go to sleep because he knew if he woke up, he had to go to school again? And just kind of providing that little turn makes you stop and think, oh, even though I think I know what's going on, it's very possible there's something else going on that's affecting these things, and they haven't developed the maturity or the language to be able to communicate that to us yet.
Mm. It's beautiful, yeah. And this one final question, how can parents help their teens cope with the growing pressures of social media, academic performance, peer influence, such a fast-paced society? I just want to say, I hope you're ending every night, right? And closing out the night acknowledging how much, yes, you've done a lot of work as a parent, but it's so important for us to acknowledge how much the child has done too. Our night at home, for me always ends with 오늘도 수고 많았다, right? Like you worked so hard and you did it, you know? I mean, yes, maybe not everything went well, but I'm acknowledging that you put in a lot of effort, and that in itself is something to be celebrated. And he loves it. Like you can see his whole face just like get
Aw.
all warmy and every night. 오늘도 수고 많았다. 오늘도 수고 많았어. 잘했어. Like just that one little comment just to close the night. Yeah, I think can slowly shift that relationship. And so, gosh, parents who are here, thank you. My goodness,
Yeah, thank you for
Dr.
joining
Sam.
us.
Yes.
Dr. Joe, it was my pleasure. And let me just say to you, 오늘도 수고 많이 했습니다.
수고 많으셨습니다.
Well, thank
Oh,
you all. We appreciate you joining us for the fireside chat tonight. And yeah, I'll turn it back over to Chiwon.
thank you both so much. 수고 많으셨습니다. I just wanted to use that. But thank you for everyone for tuning in with us until late evening. I just wanted to reiterate how thankful we are for Dr. Josephine Kim and Dr. Samuel Kim for invaluable insights and wisdom that you both have shared so much today, which was so timely as well. And moving on, I'd like to introduce to several resources that you can explore with us here, especially for parents who are here with us today. On our website, we have an online directory for Korean American mental professionals across the nation. So what you can do is you can select the state and browse Korean American mental professionals, and based on where you live, you can meet different professionals and also look over which language that they prefer as well. So if you prefer Korean, for example, you can search for the professionals who can speak in Korean. And moving on, we also have reports and bilingual blog posts. Whether you're seeking personal journeys, tips on finding right therapist, or even about parenting, our blogs offer a wealth of resources. And also, we have an incredible podcast hosted by Dr. Samuel Kim right here as well with Sharon Kim. The podcast caters to professionals and lay people, and even to those who are simply curious about research as well. And moving on, I like to mention our upcoming 2024 National Summit will be held on November 2nd. It is a great opportunity to explore key mental health topics, including workshops on psychosis, serving the elderly Korean population, and we'll also have panel sessions for grad students and private practice. The event is open to everyone, but this event is specifically designed for Korean American mental health professionals and grad students. So if you like to check out more details, the details are available by scanning the QR code, or you can also visit msgsummit.org. And next, your feedback is crucial for our next Heart to Healing Fireside Chat series. So please take a moment to submit your survey and help us enhance our next series. So if you can take out your phone, but if you cannot, we will be possibly following up with you, everyone who are here today, with emails, with a follow-up email. So yeah, I hope you can submit your thoughts or any questions or suggestions with us. And last but not least, we would like to talk about giving. Your generosity can make a real difference. By donating to our cause, you'll help us continue providing vital resources and support to Korean American individuals. Every contribution, no matter the size, helps us break down barriers and ensure that mental wellness is within reach for all. And once again, we extend our heartfelt gratitude to everyone, especially the parents who are wearing so much different hats right now, who joined us after a long day this Monday evening. We hope the rest of your week is as encouraging as our time together. Thank you again so much. Good night.